Welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. We are going over again chapters from the Profound Treasury, Volume 2, and tonight we're doing chapters 20 and 21, having to do with emptiness, shunyata, the doctrine of. So let's start by bowing in. And welcome. So this is part 5, Emptiness and Compassion, chapter 20, Emptiness and the Middle Way. And emptiness, first of all, is a translation of the Sanskrit word shunyata. The Tibetan for it is Tongyi, T-O-N-G, you might spell it N-Y-I. They both have exactly the same meaning. The first syllable, shunya, in Sanskrit, tong in Tibetan means empty. The second syllable, ta, in Sanskrit, ni in Tibetan, means ness, as in a noun. So it's emptiness. Empty of what? Empty of any concept, any idea of existence or non-existence. Things are just what they are, as they are, without the overlay of concept. This term is a key term in all of Buddhism. Shunyata, we'll use the Sanskrit. And it defines, it's one of the main descriptors for reality, this space that we inhabit here, stripped of all of our mistaken ideas, names, feelings about it. It's as it is, ta-ta-ta, which is another name for shunyata, ta-ta-ta, as it is. And this chapter starts out by observing that it can be approached in the teachings in two ways. One is, the oldest way, is through the Prajnaparamita teachings. Actually, well, we won't go through the Heart Sutra, I guess. But the Heart Sutra, the Prajnaparamita teachings appeared in India, probably in around the 2nd century BC, before Christ. And they proliferated so that there were many, many, many versions of the Prajnaparamita teachings in different lengths, as short as the syllable ah, or building on that, a page or two, which is the Heart Sutra that we all know. Thus have I heard once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha, etc., etc. All the way up to the Prajnaparamita in 500,000 verses. All these different versions of the teachings of shunyata and the implications of these teachings. 500,000 verses, that's a big, thick book. What most of us here are familiar with is the Heart Sutra, the Prajnaparamita. Prajna, there it is, Prajna is the intelligence that understands and sees and understands shunyata, truth, reality. Paramita means transcendent virtue, because there are actually two versions of prajna. Prajna can mean just normal intelligence, like your ability to do math or translate a foreign language. Just consider your cleverness, your learnedness. But prajna paramita means transcendent virtue. That is the intelligence that understands shunyata, emptiness, voidness. So the first version is in the Prajnaparamita literature, and we all have, to some degree, studied this at one time or another, I think, most people here. And the key phrase in the Prajnaparamita is, in the Prajnaparamita Hridaya, the Hridaya means heart of, is the phrase, is the what is called the famous quatrain. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is no other than emptiness. And what this is doing is it's saying that form, all of this stuff, like your hand, like this sound, anything that we take to exist, is empty. Empty of what? Empty of true existence. It has no existence. It's just a phenomena that passes in front of us in an instant, in an unmeasurable instant, literally, completely unmeasurable. It's just a passing because there's really nothing there, just an appearance. So form is empty, but emptiness could be taken to be form. In other words, you could make a thing out of it. You could make a thing out of emptiness. Say, oh, I've got emptiness. So form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is no other than form, and form is no other than emptiness. Meaning that the two, form, which is like this pair of glasses or the sound of these words, whatever it might be, and emptiness are in complete, utter union. They are each other. Emptiness is simply a word that describes reality. So is form. The things that have form are objects, like those glasses that I held up, but any object of the senses and even thoughts are regarded as forms. They are appearances which come and go. So the first explanation of emptiness comes about through the Prajnaparamita literature, starting in probably, nobody knows for sure when it originated, but about the second, maybe somewhere 200, 250 BC. We sometimes chant it. Maybe we'll be chanting it more. It's really beautiful, the Heart Sutra. The other approach to emptiness came about 300 or 400 years later with the appearance in the 2nd century AD in India of a man named Nagarjuna. That's Nagar, Juna, Juna. Nagarjuna's name means conqueror of the Nagas. Naga, Arjuna. Arjuna is conqueror. Because the story goes, the myth, that the Prajnaparamita teachings were ahead of their time. And so the Buddha arranged, maybe, for them to be taken by the Nagas. Nagas are serpent deities. And sometimes they're regarded as bad, evil, sometimes they're regarded as good. But they live in low places and in water. So there are Nagas in streams, in lakes, and in the ocean. And they live deep in the ground too. Sometimes if you see the logo for Karmadzon, it's the picture of a Garuda, a bird, an enlightened bird, which never was born flying. It never touches the ground. It's from birth to death. And it carries in its beak Nagas, because it kills and eats the Nagas. So the Nagas, what happened was that the Buddha, knowing that his time was not ready for the Prajnaparamita teachings, gave them to the Nagas. And the Nagas took them and down into the ocean, to their kingdom, beneath the seas. Nagarjuna, in one version, there are many versions, or at least a number of versions of his life. In one version, he went down into the ocean to get these teachings back, these dharma, you might say, they're hidden teachings. And In order to do it, he made all the Nagas sick through magic. And they didn't know that he had done this, and they were really miserable. And he said to them, look, he said, I could cure you, but I have a price. I want those teachings, those texts on the Prajnaparamita. They agreed. He cured them all of the illness that he had given them, and they gave him the texts, and he brought them back to humankind. And that's one version of the story. Another version of the story has it that Nagarjuna lived, by the way, for 900 years. But the sort of more normal version of the story is that he had a normal life. And in this life, he developed a philosophical system for describing and explaining shunyata. This system is called Madhyamaka, and it's one of the main philosophical or ideological systems of Buddhism altogether, one of the most important. In fact, in the Mahayana, as it developed in India, there were only two main schools. One was the Madhyamaka, as it came from Nagarjuna and was elaborated by others, some very famous people. And the other was the Yogacara, which appeared considerably later, in around the 6th century AD. And their two famous proponents are Asanga and Vasubandhu of the Yogacara. So we're talking now about the Madhyamaka, which appeared in India in around the 2nd century AD. This is an elaboration and explanation of Prajnaparamita, of Shunyata. And it's full of logical argument. There are pictures. Oh, I forgot to bring them up. I could have shared them. But if you Google Buddhist debate, you will get pictures of Tibetan monks debating. And the way in which they debate is one person is sitting on the ground and the other is standing, and he's making these gestures as he speaks to the person sitting on the ground. And it's sort of a formal system of debate. And it trains the monks' minds in these doctrines. So Madhyamaka developed in India then, started by Nagarjuna, and I had different arguments. I'll give you an example. For instance, one of the most popular and famous texts, if you want to read something, is the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. It's called Mula means root. Madhyamaka means middle way. Karika means verses. So these are the root verses on the middle way. You can also look it up in the English probably and find it. And it's full of arguments. So for instance, I'll just give you some of the ones that I remember. They're very simple. And yet, you see, Nagarjuna was sort of a natural logician. Later, in 17th century and 18th century Europe, logic would be codified, rules would be developed, and a lot of what Nagarjuna taught, the arguments that he made, conformed to those rules that appeared 1,000 years later. He didn't have them. He was just doing it by instinct. And there were three main argument styles that I remember. One is called modus ponens. This is going now to the 18th century and the rules of logic. Modus ponens. One is called modus tollens. And then there is reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum means reduction to absurdity. I'll give you an example of a reductio ad absurdum used by Nagarjuna. And remember, this is all within the context of emptiness, shunyata, that nothing has any true existence. So the Tirtaka means the heretic, the non-conforming, not to Buddhism person, asserts things have beginnings and ends. So Nagarjuna says, let's look at the arguer could be a Buddhist logician, says, let's look at the first one. You assert that things have beginnings. He says, well, if you assert that things have beginnings, then you must agree that there is a beginning to the beginning. The proponent says, yes, there has to be a beginning to the beginning. And Nagarjuna says, and if you assert that there is a beginning to the beginning, then you must agree that there is a beginning to the beginning of the beginning. See where that goes? It's endless. This is a reduction to absurdity, a reductio ad absurdum. It's one of the ways of destroying a conceptual argument, the idea that concepts have real truth, because from the Buddhist point of view, concepts don't. They're just pointers to reality, and they don't have any real existence in themselves. Here's another example. Let's say, with modus ponens, this is I'm using the Latin because this is what they were called later in the development of Western logic. But Nagarjuna just did this by sort of intuition. And modus ponens goes, if A is true, B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. So here's an example. If today is Tuesday, we'll have class. If A is true, B is true. Today is Tuesday, therefore we will have class. There's the argument, see? Did anyone not have difficulty with that? If A is true, then B is true. So then you make an assertion that A is true, and then B happens to follow. Modus tollens says, if P, then Q. Excuse me. If P, then not Q. Oh, excuse me. If P, then Q follows. Not Q, therefore not P. So here is P. If the match is lit, that's P, then Q. There is oxygen somewhere if a match lights, right? There is no, it says, there is no oxygen in the room or in this space, wherever it might be. Therefore, the match is not lit. That's the argument. If P, then Q. If not Q, then not P. So if the match is lit, there is oxygen in the environment around it. There is no oxygen in the environment, therefore the match is not lit, cannot be lit. So these are arguments that Nagarjuna used by intuition, by intelligence, and others to establish that language is merely it's actually not true. It's a way of taking things, and we live in this world created by language, and yet language is internally inconsistent, logically unverifiable, as these arguments and others show. And that's what he spent his time doing, showing you that language, concepts, are utterly, utterly unreliable. They lead you into paths of error, like believing that there's a beginning. And the same thing applies to an end, right? If the Tirtaka asserts there's an end, then the Buddhist will say, well, if you assert there's an end, there has to be an end to the end. And the guy says, granted. And he says, and then there has to be an end to the end of the end. Goes on and on, reductio ad absurdum. So this was the philosophy of Madhyamaka, and really what it's doing is destroying the belief that language carries absolute truth. It doesn't. It's a completely, in fact, it's a useful way to take things if you're enlightened. But when you're unenlightened, it reifies error. Belief in things that don't actually exist, or belief in things that are as being true that are not true. So Madhyamaka, the philosophy that came out of this, it literally means middle way. It's the middle way between anything, existence and non-existence. Both of them are extremes. They come out of language. Neither of them has any true being or non-being. Because what Madhyamaka is pointing to is the fact that what's true is our experience now, this. The words that we put on it limit it and distort it. And when we believe those words, we are living in a world that is not true, that is false. So Madhyamaka is steering us to the intelligence of our minds and senses as they grasp, understand, apprehend this world as it appears in the moment and is constantly changing. This is why it's the middle way. They say it's the middle way between eternalism and nihilism. Those are two extremes, but if there are, you could make up other extremes between existence and non-existence, between life and death. Nothing actually is alive. Nothing actually dies. These are just words that we put on what we see happening. Eternalism, it's the middle way between eternalism and nihilism. Eternalism is the doctrine that everything exists forever. Nihilism is that everything comes and goes in the midst of unconditional space, and we can do whatever we want, and there are no consequences because nothing endures. So the guy who is going to punish you won't be there tomorrow. Madhyamaka says both are false. Neither are safe nor right. Truth, real truth, Madhyamaka is saying, is non-conceptual. It is of a different order than the idea of true and false, existing and non-existing, and so forth. Those ideas lead us well astray. They lead us into the two main errors, which are the belief that I exist. I don't. Existence is a myth. It's a false way of trying to understand things. And the second belief of the fundamental error, the belief that others exist. These glasses, this mouse, the computer screen, all of them we think that they exist. I'm here, they're there. I and other. And what Madhyamaka is saying is, no, neither one of them exists. It's a false trap that we have fallen into. That what is real is in the middle. It's between them. It's not, it neither exists nor not exists. So we discover shunyata with the tool of prajna. Shunyata is what you experience, and prajna, this intelligence that begins to see it. You see, we can go through these arguments, these logical arguments, and get convinced that they're true, but the real intelligence goes beyond the intelligence that understands these arguments. It sees the truth. This is living here and now, and this is the real prajna. Shunyata is empty of dualistic fixations, I and other, which are temporary, while reality goes on, the basic nature, the supreme dharma, the enlightened state. So conceptual mind and mental concepts are not regarded as permanent damage. They just come and go. Meanwhile, reality stays forever. We're not alarmed by dualistic concepts which are just temporary. Shunyata is not a concept, but an experience. It's the experience of the real, beyond concept, though it can be described conceptually. Words can begin to talk about it. They can't get it perfectly. Words can never get anything perfectly. Like, the blue of Jill's dress. I call it blue, but yet there are a gazillion different kinds of blue. I mean, you have to experience it. and that is emptiness, shunyata. Shunyata is discovered by prajna. It is contained in prajna, like water in a cup, he says. Prajna is the way to see shunyata. It is supreme knowledge, the capability of having knowledge, this knowledge of the real world, and that we can actually live in this real world and move through it with much greater accuracy and openness, intelligence, and heart. Concepts obscure all that. Prajna is not knowledge of something. It is just knowledge, the ability to know in the fullest sense. Shunyata is not secular or regular. It's not religious, and it's not non-religious. It's just truth. And he says it's the first clear thinking and conclusion about reality in the history of the human mind. That's pretty extreme, but it seems to me to be true. The only realm that can perceive shunyata is the human realm. You have to be in a human body with a human mind. Gods can't see it because they're caught up in their blissful absorption. Hell beings can't see it because they're caught up in suffering. Only humans have the intelligence and the necessary degree of sanity to be able to discover and live in emptiness. Then he has a section called Experiencing Emptiness. Shunyata is a state of realization of our phenomenal world. It is an experience. It can also be considered a practice or a discipline. By looking into such things, you are actually working on how to understand basic reality. So shunyata, the emptiness of phenomena. Phenomena are called in Buddhism, the lingo, dharmas, and self. That's the same emptiness. The way of describing it conceptually, but not it, the same way the word table and the experience of this table are different. It's the same thing with shunyata, with emptiness. The word and the actual experience are not the same, just as the word table and your experience of this table that you're sitting in front of are different. So everything is bounded by this rule. Who does the experiencing? Emptiness. It is the total experience of emptiness that brings things as they are. It's called in Tibetan rung rik. Rung means self, and rik means knowing, or intelligence. So it's the natural, innate intelligence of this sphere that we're in that knows emptiness. It's not about vacancy, like absence of anything really, but about the absence of, it is about the absence of clinging, beyond which is a greater freedom, he says, a much clearer, unpossessed state of being. It is total spaciousness, which you can't actually label. Once you begin to label it, you lose it. You get stuck on the label. Shunyata even. So space or consciousness, we call it emptiness, but it also means fullness. Because when you strip out concept, this world is very full of messages, of communications, of blue, of loud, of sweet, of sour, of whatever it might be. So this emptiness is also a fullness, the fullness of the beauty of this world as it arises in the moment. It says this fullness has a positive quality in the sense of sanity, and it has a beautiful, colorful, full, vivid quality, this world. In the teachings, he doesn't go into this in this chapter, but in the teachings, that fullness is called luminosity, prabhasra. It's like when you get rid of concepts, concepts are like wearing sunglasses. You can't see the world because they tint it with their color. So when you strip off concepts, then the world emerges very, very vividly. And they call this in the higher teachings luminosity. The Sanskrit is Prabhasra, the Tibetan is Ursel. The Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, his given name was, when he was born, was Ursel. He says, emptiness is not about vacancy, but about the absence of clinging, beyond which is a greater freedom, a much clearer, unpossessed state of being. It is total spaciousness, which you cannot actually label. Once you begin to label it, you lose it. Space or spaciousness means fullness. Beautiful, colorful, full, vivid. Shunyata requires that you be able, willing, to give up your culture, our idiosyncratic cultures of how we live and believe our lives to be. We have to give these up in order to really fully develop and turn into a person who lives truly, which means in consonance with Shunyata. If there is not such cultural uptightness, not only is Shunyata teaching appropriate, but further Vajrayana teachings become appropriate as well. It's necessary to have some kind of culture or tradition to help you into this, because this is not something each one of us is going to discover. We're not Nagarjuna, but we can appreciate Nagarjuna and follow along. He says, as long as ego's territory has been eliminated, Mahayana practices such as the paramitas do not become new forms of cultural fixation. They are merely sort of pointers to our discoveries. Things arise, yet they do not exist. They do not exist, yet they arise. This is a formula in the teachings. With Shunyata, you realize that the emptiness of phenomena and the emptiness of yourself is the same emptiness. You might ask, then who is it that does the experiencing? It is the total experience of emptiness that experiences things as they are. It's not personal. When we talk about emptiness, we're not talking about vacancy, but about the absence of clinging. Beyond clinging, a greater freedom can be experienced, a much clearer, unpossessed state of being. It is total spaciousness, which you can't actually label. Once you begin to label it, you lose it. You become non-spacious immediately. So the people who develop prajna and see this are called bodhisattvas. They are the inhabitants of the Mahayana path, middle stage of our path. Bodhi means awake. Awake to what? Awake to emptiness. And sattva means being. So it's an awake being, a person who understands emptiness. So he says here, they're not stuck in absorption, but are doing something creative all the time, helpful for other people. It says, bodhisattvas are not using concept to understand and interpret the world. Can you imagine this? It means that we have the opportunity and the capacity to drop concepts, to drop thoughts, thinking about. So bodhisattvas see with the naked eye of prajna, which is much more intelligent than concepts. They see clearly. It's a different order of knowing. I mean, this takes a tremendous amount of courage to give up your conceptual reference points, frameworks, and begin to see with the eye of prajna as it is, just this, right where you're in the middle of. So bodhisattvas see with the naked eye. They don't have any concepts, but are just there, very naked, very open, just looking at you, which can be a bit unnerving, he says. Bodhisattvas do not have any preconceptions, and you keep building up your little paddings, which keep falling apart. We are ordinary people. When we communicate with a bodhisattva, that is usually what happens. Our paddings fall apart. And those of you who have communicated with more advanced or powerful teachers, you know how they can make your conceptual frameworks fall apart. So finally, a continual awakening of prajna. Prajna is the intelligence that sees this, that sees the absence of concept. He says the confirmation of the spiritual journey at the Hinayana level is the experience of awakening from samsara into nirvana. So this is what he's describing here is coming out of dreams. We're dreaming all the time, but when you watch your breath, for instance, and count your breaths, it cuts through dreams. So it's very helpful. I recommend it, that kind of shamatha practice. Prajna is constantly cutting through dreams and providing further inspiration to practice. Prajna occurs right at the beginning and continues through the middle right up to the end of the path. And prajna brings about further prajna. So you can experience a continual awakening of prajna, a continual growth of your prajna, of its power and clarity. In the Mahayana, what prajna exposes are egolessness and shunyata, which are almost saying the same thing. It's just that egolessness refers to belief in an I, whereas shunyata refers to the absence of belief in I and the absence of belief in other. They're both myths, concepts, and then we attach all kinds of meanings to these I's and others, which are equally mythic. You take the bodhisattva vow because you realize that continuing on the path of fixation, dualistic fixation, conceptual fixation is problematic. That's why you take the bodhisattva vow. That's part of it anyhow. You begin to realize that you do not have to be dualistically fixated, that enlightened power or Buddha nature is in you already. It's already there. It's not like you're going to develop this intelligence. And so you can enter the bodhisattva path. He says Hinayanists who just want to achieve a kind of peace are frightened by this because they sense that it presages tantra, produces fear and hesitation, a combination of arrogance and cowardice. When you become a bodhisattva-like person, you begin to realize where prajna comes from, which is from bodhicitta, awakened mind that we all have, or Buddha nature. That's where prajna is. That's where it lives. It's already there in each one of us. So you can inherit the sword of prajna. Prajna is always depicted as being a sword, two-bladed sword. You see Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, and he's holding this sword, and it's got two edges, an edge on both sides. And that's because one edge cuts through belief in self, and the other cuts through belief in other, ego and dharmas. He says you can inherit the sword of prajna, but it requires devotion, which comes from renunciation, which comes from recognition that you are already impregnated with Buddha nature. It is what we fundamentally are. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Michael. This is such profound stuff. It's really beautiful. But before we go on, Michael, we're still fairly early. Maybe we have anybody have any questions, comments, complaints? Arguments, disagreements, questions? Everybody's understanding, prajna, shunyata, two-edged sword of Manjushri. Well, okay. Michael, take away the second chapter.
Okay, so the chapter that I will be talking about is titled Realizing the Emptiness of Ordinary Reality. Toward the end of the chapter, Trungpa Rinpoche says that Shunyata experience comes from shamatha, vipassana, and egolessness. And I think at the least we could do the shamatha piece. So let's start with that. Take a good posture, good seat, straighten our back. And in doing this practice, there's a Gestalt psychologist, Fritz Perls, who I always thought must have studied Buddhism, and I actually looked it up and found out that yes, he did indeed spend time in a Japanese Zen monastery. And he used to say, lose your mind and come to your senses, which is kind of a joke and serious at the same time. But that's what we want to do. Lose conceptual mind, let it go, not reject it or push it away, but not engage further with it, essentially. Just let it be without engaging. So take a good posture, and for a few minutes, let's just work with the breath, particularly the out-breath, and just feel it. Allow ourselves to slow down. Just the natural breathing. Just be open to whatever we might be sensing, sights, sounds, bodily sensations. We might even become aware of sounds, for instance, that have been there all along, but that we weren't aware of a moment ago. Even just the whoosh, the white noise of the computer, or whatever. We're all in different spaces, somewhat the same, somewhat different. But just settle. One thing we might notice is that there's a knowing quality to present awareness. Not knowing in a conceptual sense, but in the more immediate sense of just knowing that we're seeing, knowing that we're hearing, feeling. Just very simple knowing. Very immediate, direct. Maybe just recognize that. And what Trungpa Rinpoche says about the shamatha possibility is that kunzup experiences, kunzup being another word for ordinary reality, just here, this ordinary reality where we are. Again, we sort of share some common reality in the computer screen and different reality in terms of the differences in the different spaces that we're in. But it's all ordinary reality. Ordinary reality, or concept experiences, present themselves colorfully, but without any personal, emotional attachment being made. And we're able to let go of our particular conceptual framework and just allow ourselves to be in our immediate experience. That's what it is. Colorful, but no particular attachment. He says no clinging to the phenomenal world, although the phenomenal world continues to be colorful and vivid. This is exactly what it says in the Kagyu lineage chant that we say before every practice session. Whatever arises is fresh. And try not to alter that so that our practice is free from conception. That lack of fixation brings in the element of absolute truth as well, brings about harmony and gentleness. So that's the essence of shamatha. He goes on to say something about vipassana, which really relates to resting fully in that knowing quality. And the words he uses there are words like understand and realize. But we should go back to the beginning now. So again, the title of the chapter is Realizing the Emptiness of Ordinary Reality. Now, as it turns out, this chapter that I'm about to talk about, the chapter that John just talked about, the last chapter that we talked about last week, and a good amount of the first chapter that we read next week, all come from 3 talks from 1975 seminary, titled Ground Madhyamaka 1, Ground Madhyamaka 2, and Dundam and Kunzup. Dundam and Kunzup are 2 different words for absolute and relative truth. And what the editors have done is to take certain threads out of these 3 talks, and it's helpful because it makes some of the points very clear. So the chapter that John just talked about really emphasizes the development of prajna. It's prajna that sees shunyata. That was also true of the chapter last week. This chapter this week, the chapter that I'm about to talk about, chapter 21, Realizing the Emptiness of Ordinary Reality, relates to understanding something about relative truth. It's realizing the emptiness of ordinary reality, or realizing the emptiness of relative truth. And so it's important to keep in mind that there are really 2 great Mahayana traditions, the Madhyamaka, which is one of the things that what John just talked about, and also the Yogacara. The Madhyamaka, as John just finished talking about, a very powerful presentation of cutting through all of the conceptual frameworks so that we realize absolute truth, or Dundam. The Yogacara provide a much better, much more thorough explanation about the nature of relative truth. And as Trungpa Rinpoche says in this chapter, he's going to bring in the Yogacara. In particular, the Yogacara looks at Kunzup, or relative truth, ordinary reality. And that we could experience that in 3 or maybe 4 different ways. And this relates to one of a key teaching in the Yogacara, the 3 natures. The 3 natures are the dependent nature, the imaginary nature, which is the world of concept that we just finished talking about, the dependent nature, and then the perfectly established nature. So we'll be coming to that in a little bit, but overall it's, Trungpa Rinpoche and other teachers have said that the Yogacara, the real strength of the Yogacara is in its understanding and seeing through of relative truth, relative reality. The Madhyamaka tradition really doesn't say too much about relative truth or relative reality. The way it's been presented to me in some of the classes that I've taken is that the Madhyamaka view of relative truth is it's whatever sentient beings decide that it is. That you could say in a sense that it's decided by popular vote. And so we look at the world around us and we see how there are different fashions and different fads, different ways of looking at the world that change all the time. All kinds of upheavals and evolutions and maybe reversals of evolution, hard to say. But that there's a constantly changing view of what the world is in a conventional sense. And that, as again, the Madhyamaka don't have a whole lot to say about it, but the Yogacara does. And most of this chapter, even though comes out of talks titled Ground Madhyamaka 1 and 2, really relates more to the Yogacara. So you might ask, why look at relative truth if it's relative truth? And the main point really is it's important to understand that if we don't know we're holding on, we won't let go. It's as simple as that. And the real value of understanding something about relative truth, the emptiness of ordinary reality, the emptiness of relative truth, is to develop some understanding of how we hold on, what we hold on to. Some of you know that I recently did a 2-week meditation retreat. One of the things that becomes really clear with intensive meditation practice is the degree to which our mind creates the world that it finds itself in. It's easy enough to see that at times we project things onto things in the world. But it's more than that. It's not just that mind sees what it wants to or expects. There's some very interesting ideas about that in modern cognitive psychology, with ideas about confirmation bias and recency bias, which relate to how people construct a reality in distorted ways based on seeing what they do or don't want to see, do or don't want to understand. But it's actually even more than that. The mind literally creates the world that it sees. And we can look at under a relative truth to come to understand this and maybe even experience this in some way. We can come to understand that, for instance, if we just look at our experience, that when we feel really, really good about something, have a really elated experience, we get some kind of positive news or have some kind of really positive success, then little things that might normally bother us don't. We have to stop and tie our shoe, and instead of seeing that as an irritation or a bother, it's nice to actually stop and see how beautiful the world looks for a moment. And in the other way, when we're really angry, things that ordinarily don't bother us suddenly are really irritating and bothersome. So that, again, when we actually look at these kinds of experiences, we come to see that that in something of the relative nature of things, if the feelings that we had were really inherent in these experiences and these objects, we would always feel the same way, but we don't. In fact, these experiences are empty. And that's why we can experience the same thing in very different ways from moment to moment, day to day. So anyway, we begin actually looking at the chapter by talking about ground Madhyamaka. And what Trungpa Rinpoche says is the study of Madhyamaka begins with ground Madhyamaka, which has to do with our basic approach to reality. And this is based on an understanding of the two truths, the absolute and the relative. And this is for those of you who were with us when we studied the Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva, this is exactly one of the first things he said in the Prajna chapter, that there are two truths. So we're being told over and over again that some kind of contemplation and understanding of this is an important step that we can take. So he says, in ground Madhyamaka, there isn't any particular leap into the realization of Shunyata, that it's more a matter of realizing logically and dialectically that what you are doing is, he says, useless and senseless. But anyway, just basically we're looking at coming to understand that we do create and project a certain reality onto things that in its fullest sense we could call twofold ego, as we talked about last week. And that doing this actually is problematic. It actually causes confusion and suffering, essentially. There's a footnote, and he actually says a little bit more about it, about Path Mahamudra and Fruition Mahamudra. Path Mahamudra connects with the practice of the Paramitas, which has to do with letting go of all kinds of fixations around passion, aggression, and ignorance. And the Fruition Mahamudra relates to the path of the 10 bhumis. So it really relates to the path of seeing and beyond, and beginning with the first bhumi, where there's the first real realization of emptiness. But ground Madhyamaka, as he says, is based on a contemplative approach. It's based on looking at things like what I just said a few moments ago, how when we're in a particular mood, things look one way, and when we're in a different mood, they look a different way. And actually looking further into that and coming to realize something of the emptiness of phenomena. So he asks us, the question is, how much can you hang on to this reality? And he says it's already rotting, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, and it doesn't make sense. So as he says, it's about time to come to your senses. So again, lose your mind and come to your senses. He talks very briefly about the Heart Sutra and how it doesn't have the same impact now that it did when it was originally presented. And so we need to go further. The idea is we need to that when we realize the concept of shunyata, when we actually experience it, then whatever we're involved in, we come to realize our ideas, concepts, theories, and philosophy don't hold up. And for this reason, he says that in Buddhism we have to have the practice first and then study. That in Buddhism, it's less likely to impose a philosophy upon us, although sometimes we impose philosophy upon ourselves. But really what's supposed to come out of is experience and contemplation. Meditating, contemplating, and study. So the idea is that we can think about these things conceptually, but the point is to look further and actually realize something about our actual experience in the world. And ultimately that comes down to, again, realizing the emptiness of ordinary reality, the emptiness of relative truth. The next section in this book begins to talk about kunzup as one of the terms for relative truth, relative reality, ordinary reality. And it's entitled, Kunzup is One Gigantic World of Incest. So we'll come back to the incest point in a minute. But first of all, he says that there are two levels of perceiving shunyata: superficial prajna and transcendental prajna, transcendental prajna perception. And these relate to relative and ultimate truth. So most of what we're going to be talking about is in this piece of the chapter relates to the first of the three natures, the imaginary nature, or sometimes it's called the constructed nature. That's relative truth, relative reality. And he says relative is a convenient English translation of kunzup, but actually kunzup means all outfitted, or an outfit that fits everything. Sometimes I've heard it also translated as all covered, that it's, again, the sense that our perceptions of the world are all clothed, all covered by our conceptual framework. So it's like an outfit. Or he also says like a self-existing show, which ultimately, when we come to realize that that's what it is, that this conceptual framework is based on concepts that don't really connect directly with reality, that's when we begin to realize something of their illusory nature. This is why one of the first slogans in Lojong training is regard all dharmas as dreams. We begin to realize that the world, like a dream, where the mind projects something that we take to be real, that our ordinary experience also involves a projection of something that we take to be real, but actually isn't. He says that as perceiver of concept, perceiver of relative reality, ordinary reality, we'd like to see things in our own way, in a certain fashion, so we could be the audience or we could be the show. But what the idea of kunzup, and this is where it comes into the notion of relative truth or relative reality, is that the different ways in which we perceive the world and understand the world are based on all kinds of interdependent causes and conditions. Our particular histories, our acculturation, the form that we're in as being in the human realm as opposed to being in the animal realm or some of the other realms that are said to exist. Whatever life experiences we've had, that all of these things result in the fact that we each see the world in our own individual way. So the idea of kunzup implies that different people have different perspectives of the world. And he says, when we try to discuss reality, we have disagreements. Just look at the political world if you have any question about that at all. Every one of us has a different attitude, for instance, about water. And he goes into the experiences of different beings in the different realms. That for a hell realm being, water can appear as like lava, hot, dangerous, threatening. For beings in the hungry ghost realm, totally consumed with need, it can appear in all kinds of ways as unattainable or things. So that for different beings in different realms, let alone for our own experiences in the human realm, we see things in different ways, and that's because it's relative. It's relative to the causes and conditions that create it. Now, we tend to think our way of seeing it is right. Our way of seeing it is perhaps best, but if we can let go of that a little bit, we come to see that, again, mind creates the world that it experiences, and at its worst, from a Hinayana sense, mind creates the world that it finds itself trapped in. In any case, as he says, some people's visions or concepts might be more accurate, and some approaches might be very gross and wrong. And he goes into a little bit here with something that he also will talk about a little bit more in the chapter, the difference between neurosis and psychosis. But it actually ultimately says the whole approach is questionable. Again, from a in the Yogacara, all of this is talking about the imaginary nature. It's not the world as it actually is, although it has some relationship to it, but it's the world that we conceive, the world that we create, the world that we project. And he says when we really look into this, the edges of psychosis and neurosis, psychosis being a complete detachment from reality, where, as he says later, a dog is seen as a lion, for instance, that the edges of psychosis and neurosis begin to dissolve, and they come so close together that we're not able to distinguish between the two. I think most people here know that in my professional life I worked as a psychologist with children and adolescents, but early on I actually worked for a couple of years with adults with significant mental illness. And I have to say that after spending a day in a halfway house type facility for people who are going into or coming out of the hospital usually, that I could walk away saying, well, I know the world isn't the way they think it is, but I'm not so sure the world's the way I think it is either. And it's a very immediate experience of that, because you come to realize the degree to which the things that we take to just be real in a very common, ordinary sense, again, that really it's a question of a relative reality, that it's a question of relative truth. He says with Kunzup, as we come to understand the difference, he says the distinction between unreasonable and reasonable logic begins to break down into a series of expectations and preconceptions. And that's really the nature of the imaginary nature. Expectations and preconceptions, fixations and concepts of all kinds. And that's the world that we typically find ourselves in out of habit. He says that Kunzup is a relative reality, relative truth, is a show-off, a bluff. There's no substance, even though there's still a lot of things going on. But he also says it shouldn't be looked down upon. He says, in fact, we have a lot of problems realizing Kunzup and relating with the world. So what he's warning about here, I think, is falling into too much of a nihilistic point of view, that nothing matters, nothing has any real significance. When in fact there's still, again, cause and effect. But to go on, he says this dressed up world, this Kunzup world, this all outfitted relative truth, ordinary reality world is actually very hard to work with, and that we need to ultimately transcend neurosis and psychosis and become sane through our relationship with the spiritual friend. And that when we've experienced twofold egolessness, we see that the real world is actually the real world, as opposed to this imagined world, this imaginary nature that we project. He says that Kunzup is said to be empty of itself and by itself, that it's empty of its own nature. It's based on continuously filling gaps of all kinds, one concept leading to another. This is precisely why, when we read the chapter on Shamatha Vipassana from Tulku Ujin, he said it's so important to begin with Shamatha, because we're so caught up in this habit of following thought after thought, filling the gaps. But again, ultimately, Kunzup is empty of itself. It's relative truth because it's not absolute. And he says it's not only relative truth because it's known as relative truth, but it's because it has its own relatives, that it's self-perpetuating. Again, this is this momentum of thought after thought, concept after concept, feeling after feeling. And this is where he gets into the idea of actually describing it as incestuous. I think more often when I've read things about the imaginary nature, it's related more to the interrelatedness or interconnectedness of things. Again, the multiple causes and conditions that go into the appearance of anything in our world, and understanding the interdependent nature of things. But with the point of view that he's trying to make with describing it as incestuous, is the degree to which, again, mind sees what it wants to see, mind projects what it wants to project, that our mind creates the world through its habitual fixations and preconceptions. He says that's why we're in trouble. We keep having to return to our own selves, the Kunzup world of incest, in which things keep reproducing, and there's no way out and no way in. So this next section in the chapter is titled Self-Perpetuating Mental Pigeonholing, where he really gets into exactly how this incestuous or interconnected, interrelated experience of the imaginary nature works. And he says to understand, and this is where he directly says that to understand Kunzup, he's decided to borrow from the Yogacara or mind-only tradition. And he says, according to Yogacara, Kunzup is actually our state of mind. The Yogacharans say that the relative world is made out of our mind. And just to go a little bit further with this, just a little bit of excerpt from a description of the Yogacara. A deceptive trick, this is from a different text altogether. A deceptive trick is built into the way in which consciousness operates at every moment. Consciousness projects and constructs a cognitive object in such a way that it disowns its own creation. In other words, we actually create the world that we then externalize and see as being out there. Consciousness projects and constructs a cognitive object in such a way that it disowns its own creation, pretending the object is out there, in order to render that object capable of being appropriated. Even while what we cognize is occurring within our active cognition, we cognize it as if it were external to our consciousness. Consciousness engages in this deceptive game of projection, dissociation, and appropriation because there is no self. So this is perhaps a more technical way of what Trungpa Rinpoche says, that first we project a sense of other, and from having projected a sense of other, we maintain a sense of self as well. But we do this by projecting what's actually mind as being external to us. And then from there developing, in the most neurotic sense, all of the strategies that involve passion, aggression, and ignorance. But to continue with this notion of the incestuous nature of Kunzup, Trungpa Rinpoche says, when we see something for the first time, something completely new, we know how to react to it immediately. Why? We know how to handle new situations because we know how to relate to new food, new tastes, new visions, new sounds, new concepts, and ideas. Because, he says, we automatically put them into our preconceived pigeonholes. That we do this all the time. That these preconceptions are always there. So that when we see something new, it's really not new because we already have expectations about it. It goes back to the expectations and preconceptions. It's not really new because we have expectations about it. And we have all these basic assumptions, and he lists some. We have notions of colors, we have notions of shapes, preconcepts of shapes, we have notion of movement, fast and slow, sizes. They're already in our mind, and our mind is already programmed. So therefore we know how to act and how to relate to things. Everything is recorded in our brain system. So in this way, the things that we see, he says, are perpetuating themselves. And we could ask, aren't new things happening all the time, every day? And he says, according to the Yogacara tradition, that's not true. That if we really come to look and understand at the Kunzup aspect of reality, the way in which we habitually ordinary function, this is without meditation practice, without the clarity that meditation practice develops. If we look at that, then we see that the Kunzup is this constant incest, this constant interrelationship of any experience in terms of our already existing concepts and ideas. That the whole thing is, as he says, the whole thing is constantly inbreeding. That he says, we manage to put everything into our own mental preconceptions and pigeonholes all the time, so that we don't experience things as fresh and new. And again, if we just think back to the Kagyu lineage chant, the line that reads, awareness is the body of meditation, whatever arises is fresh, to this meditator who rests without altering it. That's, if we can experience the freshness first by letting go and then not altering it, then our meditation is free from conception. And that's still a shamatha experience, although it's obviously a very advanced shamatha. But ordinarily, we manage to put everything into our mental preconceptions and pigeonholes all the time. He actually, at this point, so again, we're still talking about the imaginary nature, the constructed nature. Again, this world of concepts and ideas, this all outfitted, all costumed world that we live in, this kunzup world. And it begins talking a little bit about kunzup and true kunzup and false kunzup. So false kunzup is the world, again, of psychosis. Whereas realistic or true concept is our ability to just see simple reality. So false kunzup would be, as he says, would be like seeing your dog as a lion, whereas true kunzup is neurotic or relatively true kunzup. The false kunzup involves the psychotic dimension, he says, of building up mental images, like thinking the CIA is following you. Of course, that could be true sometimes, but we'll leave that out. In psychosis, he says there's an immense exaggeration of reality. And gives the traditional example of seeing a rope as a snake. And here's the important part of this, that as far as our mind's concerned, if someone sees a rope as a snake, it's true. And they're still going to react as if that were the case. They are still going to be panicked, frightened, trying to get away, if you really thought that a rope was a snake. So in that sense, it's true. But at the same time, it's, as he says, it's perverted, which is why the psychotic world is a kind of kunzup. It's still true to the person experiencing it, even if everybody else would say that's just a rope, wire, or that's just a dog, it's not a lion. But to that person, and in terms of how they react and how they're seeing the world, it's still true. As he says, although it is not all that true, it cannot be denied it's false, because after all, it is what the person is experiencing on the spot. He says it's a true lie, a true false reality. And actually with that, the interesting thing there, and again, I don't know what people's experiences are with people who really, to that degree, have lost touch with what we ordinarily call reality. But it does get across that sense of both real and unreal in terms of experience, a true lie. It's still certainly that person's experience. And then he goes, so with that, he then begins talking about pure kunzup as ordinary reality. And with pure kunzup, there's no hallucination. We just see blue as blue, snake as snake, rope as rope. He says real things are seen as they are. And he says this is a so-called sane person's attitude to reality, kind of what everyday people, anybody on the street, most people on the street, would call reality. And it's he says it's what we mean by being grounded. But he actually goes on to say that maybe you might think that this isn't so profound, everybody can do it, but actually it's impossible, very difficult to experience real kunzup. And this is getting into the second nature, the dependent nature. He says most people can't see things as they are properly and directly, although true kunzup, and he says, although true kunzup is still considered neurotic, there's still a sense of distortion to true kunzup. There has to be some kind of simple truth, otherwise we couldn't do anything with our lives. We need to take care of our physical world. We have to have a sense of what's reality and what's not reality. Now, I should say that this point, the point that Trungpa Rinpoche is making here about true and false kunzup, or false kunzup again being the kind of experience of someone who's a real break with ordinary reality. There's depending on who you read in terms of the Yogacara, there's some people who say that really there's no difference, that it's still, whether it's psychotic or just ordinary garden, standard ordinary neurosis, that it's still the imaginary nature, and that in fact it's the same thing. It's just taken to a much greater degree. So in one sense, it's still just the psychotic experience, false kunzup, is just a really exaggerated sense of the imaginary nature. But even our ordinary neurotic, the way that we're ordinarily caught up in the imaginary nature of this world of concept, even that has an element of falsity and truth to it in the same way, which is why I think an analogy of the rope and the seeing the snake as a rope, and coming to understand that it's true in terms of the person's experience, it's not true in an absolute sense. And that's true for all of us. The next section within this overall piece here is pure kunzup as an enlightened sanity. And this, he says, this is how you see once we started on the Bodhisattva path. So traditionally, the Bodhisattva path really begins with the first bhumi, where there's the first real, the path of seeing, where there's the joy, where there's this, there's a true direct experience of twofold egolessness and emptiness, shunyata. He says only someone who, as he says, only someone who has cut through twofold ego is able to see things as they are in their fullest and most real sense. Fullest and most real sense. So this is the perfect nature, or the perfectly established nature. And the dependent nature is, again, the ordinary reality, but seen with more clarity, but still without a real understanding of emptiness. I guess that's the best way. That's the best I can make of it. Best I can explain it. He says people who experience twofold ego, in other words, me, and presumably, anyway, random people in the street are all wrapped up in their preconceptions, memories, dreams, and fantasies. Because of that, their attitude toward things in the world, water, fire, black, blue, red, and white, are distorted because we have our biases, we have our conceptual frameworks, we have our preconceptions. We get caught up again in this incestuous constructed reality. He says there's still a little bit of attachment. This is still on the level of dependent nature, as opposed to the perfect nature, where we see reality, where we see things in their fullest and most real sense. In the dependent nature, he says, there's still a little attachment. The people may see blue as blue, he says. At the same time, they use that to reinforce their idea of how blue affects their state of mind. He says whether they regard things as powerful, good, nice, or threatening, there are always psychological implications behind the colors, forms, noises, physical sensations they perceive. So what he's referring to here with this dependent nature is, it's another way of talking about that last half-fold of ego that we talked about last week. Again, as he said in one of the previous talks, that with 1.5-fold ego, we've cut through ego of self, and we've cut the attitude toward reality, but we haven't cut through the attituder, the conceptualizer, the philosophizer, that there's still a sense of perceiver and perceived, and for that reason it's the dependent nature, not the perfectly established nature. There's always, as he says, there's always some implication behind things. And then he says true kunzup is very difficult to experience, although it's very ordinary. But once we've experienced the second level of pure kunzup, it's impossible to relapse to the first level of kunzup. This is, again, he's talking about the path of seeing in the first bhumi, for, in terms of the bodhisattva path. This also relates back to what he said earlier about superficial and transcendental prajna. At this point, we're really on the path of seeing. We've really seen through twofold ego thoroughly, including that last half-fold of ego, where there's still some attachment to perceiver and perceived, still some attachment to duality. Then it's not the transcendental prajna perception that he talked about earlier. So again, he says, ultimately, this kind of prajna is seeing kunzup as it is. And he says that really any perception we have that clarifies things is a form of prajna. But if we go further with prajna, we begin to see how we're coloring reality. And I think, again, that's the main point, what he's trying to work us through to in this chapter, is coming to see relative reality, relative truth, as the relative truth that it is. And to see that we color reality, that we have this, because of our preconceptions, our habitual ways of thinking, that we again and again create the world that we find ourselves living in. And that with that, when we come to see that we begin to see through kunzup. The last section is titled Kunzup and Emptiness. This is where he says that the shunyata experience comes from shamatha, vipassana, and egolessness. So again, the shamatha aspect of experiencing kunzup is being able to see things without, that, as he says, things present themselves colorfully, but we see them without any personal emotional attachment being made. So we've cut through ego of self, and we begin to cut through as well the any kind of attachment to things. There's no clinging to the phenomenal world, he says, though the phenomenal world continues to be colorful and vivid. The Vipassana element is that we begin to understand how to see things in a very simple, non-aggressive way. We begin to see things as an illusion. So this is really coming to see the relative nature of things and seeing that things aren't as fixed, solid, and definite as we ordinarily take things to be. It's really fully resting in the knowing quality of mind and allowing it to manifest to its fullness, full. So that we have, as he says, this fullest perception of reality. When this happens, he says, we begin to see things as a self-existing game that does not apply individually or personally to us or others. We begin to realize the mirageness, again, the illusory nature, the dreamlike nature. We begin to realize the mirageness of the situation in a very simple and direct way. We see that things are not all that good, not all that bad, not all that entertaining, not all that non-entertaining. Another thing we see, another way of putting this is we see things beyond any exaggeration or any denial. We see things beyond eternalism and nihilism. We see beyond the two extremes. He says, on the whole, there's no substance to things, although there's seeming substance. This is another way of talking about seeing things as appearance emptiness, form and emptiness. And he just begins to describe, I'm just going to try to finish up, there's only a couple of minutes left and near the end. It begins to talk about some of the experiences we have that, in which, again, we might see through Kunze, relative reality, and have a sense of ultimate truth. And he says this mostly comes up through experiences of contrast. And he describes different kinds of experiences where we have some kind of expectation, some sort of, he says, extreme threats, emotional threats, extreme messages of all kinds are presented to us. And that with that we might experience shunyata, because they're so extraordinarily intense, therefore they become so clearly ordinarily a mirage. On a simpler level than some of the things he talked about, what this made me think of is how many times as a kid, and even as a working adult when I wasn't retired, how many times on Sunday night I feel so awful about the week that was about to begin, and almost always Monday was never as bad as the dread that I had Sunday night. And you begin to see this is just mind creating a world that doesn't exist, and that the actual world is very different from, or can be very different from, what we think. And for this reason, he says, you might think shunyata would be purely a meditative experience, but that's not the case. It's also a post-meditative experience, that extreme situations happen all the time. And he lists some, everything from somebody takes your ice cream to somebody takes away your girlfriend or boyfriend, your partner. And he says, because we're fixated so powerfully, we have such a solid idea about something, and then something comes along and takes that away, that brings about a kind of flash between contrasting extremes, that this immense grasping and immense loss of that grasping brings about a feeling of loss and gain at the same time, absolute loss, absolute gain, simultaneously hot and cold. And he says it's not involving freaking out or simple-mindedness that we can't tell good from bad. Rather, it's because there's an intelligence, and this is, again, comes back to the prajna, the looking further vipassana to prajna. This is because there's an intelligence that experiences the departing situation and the coming situation as one experience. And that experience cuts through the birth of crude and subtle fixations altogether by allowing you to realize the truth of Dharma. And he says this usually comes in a sequence of loss becomes gain, and then loss and gain at the same time. But at the Mahayana level, this is, the real gain comes from the letting go, the opening up. But at the same time, there is loss as well. So it's a very powerful experience. I think most of the time that's not how we react to situations of extreme loss. But if we have some meditative stability, again, this is where the shamatha piece becomes so important. Maybe we can experience things this way. Otherwise, I think we probably need a little less heavy a sense of loss. But we can still see that contrast between what we expect, what we fixate on, and what actually happens. And rather than just saying, oh, I was wrong about that, we can actually realize that that's a momentary glimpse of emptiness, shunyata, absence of conception and preconception. It's 9 o'clock. I will finish with two more sentences. Because he ends by going back to the Hinayana and talking about the blind grandmother, which, if you remember from the 12 Nidanas, the formation of karma, the blind grandmother is a metaphor, an image representing ignorance, just fundamental ignorance. The idea is a blind grandmother lives almost entirely in the past, which is exactly how ignorance functions in us. It again goes back to the way in which we're habitually caught up in our preconceptions and expectations and creating a world that out of these preconceptions and expectations that really is a perpetuation of our past into the present in a neurotic way. And he says, how can we let go of this blind grandmother? How can we let go of this ignorance? The only way is to abandon your blind grandmother, to let her go by not feeding her any further neurosis. And the way we don't feed further neurosis is to begin with through our meditation practice, and then ultimately through realizing something about the true nature of our mind. So with that, I'll stop. I'm only a minute over. But it's fun to try to get through that entire chapter. So thank you, everyone. I guess we can close with the dedication of merit. And the prayer for peace. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy of wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigman's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Michael.
Michael. Thank you,
Thank
John.
you, Michael. Thank you, John.
Thank you both.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a good night.
Thank you both. Take care.
Oh, that was a mouthful. Great. See you later.